Here's something strange. Millions of people have heard these stories since childhood. Sunday school flannel boards, Christmas pageants, quiet readings before bed. And yet, ask a room full of longtime believers what the prodigal son is actually about, or why the workers in the vineyard get paid the same wage, or what the mustard seed is really saying about the kingdom of God, and you'll get 15 different answers, most of them wrong. Not wrong because people weren't paying attention. Wrong because these stories were never meant to be read the way we read them. Jesus didn't tell parables to make truth easier to understand. In one strange, almost uncomfortable moment, he tells his disciples the opposite, that the stories were designed to conceal as much as they reveal, sorting out those who were only curious from those who were willing to actually change. That should stop you for a second. These aren't gentle little morality tales for children. They're loaded. They're subversive. Some of them would have made his original audience furious. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to walk through 15 of these stories. The sower, the Samaritan, the prodigal, the talents, the wise and foolish builders, and more. And in almost every case, we're going to find that the popular version, the one you probably grew up with, missed the point entirely. Stick around for the ending, because the 15th lesson is the one most people skip past without ever noticing it's there, and it might be the one that says the most about how you're actually living right now. Let's start where Jesus started. Lesson 1, the sower. It was never about the seed picture. A farmer walking a field, scattering seed by hand. Some falls on the hard path and birds eat it instantly. Some falls on rocky ground, springs up fast, and dies just as fast because it has no root. Some falls among thorns and gets choked out. And some falls on good soil and produces more than anyone expected. Most people hear this and think it's a story about the seed, about the message being strong enough to survive. It isn't. The seed is identical in every case. The message never changes. What changes is the soil. Jesus is describing 4 conditions of the human heart. One closed off entirely, one shallow and emotional, one distracted and crowded, and one genuinely open. The uncomfortable implication is that the same truth, the same sermon, the same moment of clarity can land on 4 different people and produce 4 completely different outcomes, and the difference isn't the truth. It's what each person has done with their own attention, their own distractions, their own defenses. Think about the last time you heard something that should have changed you. A piece of advice, a hard conversation, a warning, and it just slid off. That wasn't the message failing, that was the soil. Here's the takeaway line worth remembering. The problem is rarely what you hear. It's the ground you've let your life become. Lesson 2, the Good Samaritan. It isn't about being nice. Ask someone what this story means, and they'll usually say, be kind to strangers. True, but shallow, and it misses why the story actually works. A man is beaten and left half dead on the road. A priest walks by and crosses to the other side. A Levite, a religious professional, does the same. Then a Samaritan stops and helps at real cost to himself. Here's what gets lost. Jews and Samaritans despised each other. This wasn't a minor cultural friction. It was centuries of religious and ethnic contempt. Jesus' original audience would have expected the hero of this story to be a fellow Jew. Instead, he makes the enemy the hero, and the religious insiders the villains. Jesus was answering the question, who is my neighbor? A question the man asking it wanted to narrow down, to limit his obligation. Jesus answers by blowing the category open completely. Your neighbor isn't the person who looks like you or worships like you. It's whoever is in front of you, bleeding, regardless of which side of the divide they're on. Think about the modern version of that. The coworker whose politics you can't stand, the family member who embarrassed you, the person your community has quietly written off. That's who the story is actually about. The takeaway, mercy that only extends to people you already like, isn't mercy. It's preference wearing a disguise. Lesson 3, the workers in the vineyard. Grace isn't fair, and that's the point a landowner hires workers at dawn, promising a day's wage. He hires more at 9, at noon, at 3, and finally at 5, an hour before quitting time. At the end of the day, he pays everyone the exact same amount. The workers who started at dawn are furious. And if we're honest, so are we, reading it. It feels unjust. That reaction is exactly the point Jesus is making. This parable isn't really about labor economics. It's about how threatened we feel when grace is given to someone who, in our eyes, hasn't earned it. The landowner's response is simple. I haven't wronged you. I gave you what we agreed on. Are you angry because I am generous? This lands hardest on people who've spent years doing everything right. The responsible sibling, the faithful employee, the person who followed every rule, watching someone else receive the same forgiveness, the same second chance, the same welcome, after doing far less to deserve it. The story isn't defending laziness. It's confronting our resentment toward generosity we didn't get to control. The takeaway: if grace ever starts to feel fair to you, you've probably stopped needing it. Lesson 4. The Prodigal Son. The story isn't really about the prodigal. A younger son demands his inheritance early, effectively telling his father he wishes he were already dead, squanders it, and comes home broke and ashamed, rehearsing an apology. Most retellings stop there, with the father running to embrace him. Beautiful and true. But the story doesn't end there, and that's the part almost everyone forgets. The older brother refuses to join the celebration. He's obedient, dutiful, resentful, and standing outside in the dark while the party happens without him. Jesus originally told this to religious leaders who were furious that he welcomed sinners and outcasts. The older brother is them. He's the version of us that does everything correctly and quietly seethes when someone else gets celebrated for finally showing up. The father goes out to both sons. He runs to the younger one in the road, and he leaves the party to plead with the older one at the door. Both are equally lost. One just doesn't know it yet. The takeaway: it's possible to never leave home and still be estranged from grace. But what Jesus says next is even harder to hear, because the next few lessons are about what happens once you're actually inside the house. Lesson 5. The Unmerciful Servant. Forgiveness was never meant to be transactional. A servant owes his king an amount so large it could never realistically be repaid, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of days' wages. The king forgives the entire debt on the spot. That same servant then finds someone who owes him a small, repayable amount and has him thrown into prison for it. The math is the whole message. Jesus deliberately makes the first debt absurdly large and the second one trivially small, so the servant's cruelty looks as grotesque as it actually is. We tend to treat forgiveness like a ledger. I'll forgive you once, if you earn it back, if the offense is small enough. Jesus is describing something else entirely. Forgiveness that flows out of having been forgiven an unpayable debt yourself. Think of the grudge you're still carrying, the friend who betrayed a confidence, the parent who failed you, the partner who broke trust. Now think of everything you've ever needed forgiven. The scale rarely favors your side of the ledger the way we assume it does. The takeaway: unforgiveness is usually just forgetting how much you've already been forgiven. Lesson 6. The Rich Fool. It was never about the money. A wealthy farmer has such a good harvest that he tears down his barns to build bigger ones, planning to finally relax and enjoy his abundance. That very night, he dies, and none of it goes with him. People often flatten this into, money is bad. It isn't. The man isn't condemned for being rich. He's condemned for a very specific delusion: the belief that abundance equals security, and that security equals a soul finally at rest. Notice his internal monologue: I will say to my soul, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. He's trying to feed his soul with something that was never designed to satisfy it. This is arguably more relevant now than it's ever been. Replace Barnes with a bigger salary, a fuller portfolio, a longer resume, a more impressive title, and the same trap is everywhere. The story isn't warning against having things. It's warning against asking things to do a job only meaning and connection to God can actually do. The takeaway: you can build bigger barns your whole life and still die with an empty room. Lesson 7. The Persistent Widow. It isn't about pestering God into giving. A widow keeps demanding justice from a corrupt, indifferent judge. He ignores her repeatedly, until finally he gives in, not because he's moved by her cause, but because he's worn out by her persistence. A common but shallow reading treats this as, nag God enough and he'll eventually cave, which quietly implies God is reluctant, distant, or annoyed by our requests, much like the judge. Jesus actually makes the opposite argument, using a how much more logic common in Jewish teaching. If even a corrupt, uncaring judge eventually gives justice, how much more will a good and loving father respond to those who cry out to him, and he won't need to be worn down first. The parable isn't really about God's reluctance. It's about our endurance. It was told, the text says, so that people would not lose heart. It's addressing the very real experience of praying for something for years with no visible answer, and the temptation to just stop asking. The takeaway: persistence in prayer isn't about convincing a reluctant God. It's about refusing to give up before the answer arrives. The next teaching might be the most quietly radical one in this entire list because it isn't really about an outsider at all. It's about the person standing closest to God who somehow ends up furthest away. Lesson 8. The Pharisee and the Tax Collector. Confidence can be the real danger. Two men go to the temple to pray. The Pharisee thanks God that he isn't like other sinful people, listing his religious accomplishments. The tax collector, a man in a profession associated with corruption and betrayal of his own people, won't even lift his eyes and simply asks for mercy. Jesus says the tax collector, not the Pharisee, went home justified. This would have scandalized his audience. The Pharisee was, by every visible measure, the more devout, disciplined, moral man. The tax collector was, professionally and socially, the villain. The point isn't that religious devotion is bad. It's that the moment devotion becomes a source of self-congratulation rather than humility, it stops connecting you to God and starts becoming a wall between you and Him. This shows up today in subtler ways, comparing your parenting, your marriage, your habits, your faith to someone else's, and quietly building your sense of worth on being the better one in the comparison. The takeaway, the posture that opens the door to grace, is empty hands, not a full resume. Lesson 9. The Lost Sheep. The math doesn't make sense, and that's the message. A shepherd with 100 sheep loses one and leaves the 99 to go find it. Read quickly. This sounds inefficient, even reckless. Why risk 99 for one? That's exactly the emotional discomfort Jesus wants his listeners to sit with. The story isn't making an argument about herd management. It's making an argument about how God values a single person. In the culture Jesus was speaking to, the sinners he spent time with were considered expendable, not worth the religious elite's attention. This story answers that assumption directly. Heaven doesn't do the math the way we do. One matters enough to leave the 99. If you've ever felt like the one who wandered, the one who messed up too badly to be worth chasing, this is the story that answers that fear directly, and it answers it before you even finish asking the question. The takeaway: you were never a rounding error. You were always the one worth going after. Lesson 10. The mustard seed. Smallness wasn't a flaw, it was the design. A mustard seed is tiny, almost invisible, and yet it grows into a large plant that birds can nest in. The common reading stops at, "Big things start small," which is true but incomplete. Jesus was specifically describing the kingdom of God, which, to his audience, was supposed to arrive with the overwhelming, visible power of an empire. Armies, thrones, immediate political dominance. Instead, Jesus compares it to the smallest, least impressive seed available. The kingdom doesn't announce itself with force. It starts quietly, almost unnoticeably, and grows in ways that take time to become visible. This matters for how we judge our own lives. A small act of honesty, one changed habit, one quiet decision to forgive, these rarely feel significant in the moment. But this parable insists that God's work is often unimpressive at the start and enormous by the end. The takeaway: don't despise what looks small. That might be exactly what it's supposed to look like right now. Here's where things shift, because the next teaching completely changes how people usually read the ending of the age. Lesson 11. The Wheat and the Weeds. Patience isn't passivity. A farmer plants good seed, but an enemy secretly sows weeds among it. The servants want to rip out the weeds immediately. The farmer tells them to wait because pulling them now would uproot the wheat too. Let both grow together until the harvest. People often use this parable to argue against ever confronting wrongdoing, treating it as a call to simply tolerate everything. That's not quite what's happening. Jesus is addressing something more specific: the temptation to try to perfectly and permanently separate the righteous from the wicked right now, by force, using our own judgment. His answer is that this job doesn't belong to us, and premature attempts to do it will do more damage than good. This has enormous personal relevance. It's tempting to write certain people off entirely, as a lost cause, unworthy of patience, beyond change, often because their story isn't finished yet and neither is ours. The takeaway: some things aren't yours to uproot, they're yours to be patient with. Lesson 12. The Talents. It was never really about money. A master gives 3 servants different amounts of money before leaving on a journey: 5 talents, 2, and 1. The first 2 invest and double their money. The third, afraid of losing what he'd been given, buries it in the ground. When the master returns, he rewards the first 2 and condemns the third, not for losing money but for doing nothing with it out of fear. This is often reduced to a lesson about financial investing, which misses the far more personal point. A talent here is a sum of money, but Jesus is clearly using it to describe something broader: the abilities, opportunities, time, and resources each person has been entrusted with. The buried servant's core problem wasn't laziness exactly, it was fear. He describes the master as harsh and says that's why he played it safe. Fear of failure led directly to complete inaction. This speaks to anyone sitting on a skill, an idea, or a calling, too afraid of getting it wrong to ever attempt it at all. The parable suggests that burying your potential out of fear isn't the safe choice it feels like. It's the one guaranteed way to waste it entirely. The takeaway, the risk isn't in using what you've been given badly, it's in never using it at all. Lesson 13. The wise and foolish builders. Hearing was never the finish line. Two men build houses, one on rock, one on sand. The storm comes for both. Only the house on rock survives. Jesus is explicit about what separates them. It isn't who heard his words, both builders presumably had. It's who acted on them. This one lands hard in a culture saturated with content. Sermons, podcasts, books, videos, exactly like this one, where it's entirely possible to consume enormous amounts of teaching and feel spiritually accomplished without ever actually changing a single behavior. Knowledge was never the goal. Jesus consistently measures people by what they do, not merely by what they've heard or agreed with intellectually. The storm doesn't ask what you knew, it tests what you built. The takeaway. Understanding a teaching and living by it are two entirely different houses, and only one of them survives the storm. Lesson 14. The Great Banquet. The invitation goes to people who never expected. A man prepares a great banquet and invites many guests, all of whom make excuses, a new field, new oxen, a new marriage, and refuse to come. Furious, the host sends his servants into the streets to bring in the poor, the disabled, the outsiders, anyone willing to fill the seats. The original invited guests represent the religious establishment who assumed their place at God's table was secure and treated the invitation casually. The replacements represent everyone considered unworthy, unqualified, or unlikely. The uncomfortable implication is that proximity to religion, tradition, or status guarantees nothing. What matters is actually responding when the invitation comes, rather than assuming you can attend on your own schedule. This is a warning against spiritual complacency, the assumption that because you grew up in the faith or have always identified as a believer, the invitation will simply wait for you indefinitely. The takeaway. An open invitation still requires you to actually walk through the door. Lesson 15. The Two Debtors. The One Lesson. Almost everyone skips a moneylender forgives two debtors, one who owed a small amount and one who owed 10 times more. Jesus asks a Pharisee named Simon which debtor will love the moneylender more. Simon answers correctly that it's the one forgiven the larger debt. Jesus then uses this to explain the extravagant devotion of a woman weeping at his feet, whom Simon had privately judged. Her love, Jesus says, is proportional to how much she understands she's been forgiven. Whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. Here's what most people miss entirely. This isn't primarily a story about the woman. It's a mirror held up to Simon and to us. Simon assumed he was the smaller debtor, someone who needed only a little grace, and so his love, his gratitude, his devotion stayed correspondingly small and cold. The most overlooked and arguably the most important lesson in all 15 parables is this: your capacity to love is directly shaped by your honesty about how much you've needed to be forgiven. People who minimize their own need for grace tend to love cautiously, judge quickly, and stay emotionally distant from both God and other people. People who are honest about the size of their debt tend to love recklessly, gratefully, without needing to keep score. The takeaway, how much you love, is rarely a mystery. It usually reveals exactly how much grace you think you actually needed. Closing 15 stories. 15 ordinary images. Seeds, coins, banquets, debts, roads, storms. None of them were ever meant to just be admired. Jesus wasn't collecting fans of good storytelling. He was describing, again and again, from different angles, what it actually looks like to live differently once you understand grace, mercy, patience, and love the way he does. So here's the honest question worth sitting with before you go. Which one of these actually described you? Were you the older brother outside the party? The servant who buried what he'd been given out of fear? The one who assumed his debt was small and loved accordingly? That's worth answering honestly, maybe even out loud, maybe in the comments below, because the parables were never just meant to be understood. They were meant to be lived. Jesus never said, "Blessed are those who hear these words." He said, "Blessed are those who hear them and do them." If this changed how you see even one of these stories, consider subscribing because there are dozens more moments like this hiding in plain sight throughout the Gospels, waiting for someone to actually stop and look twice.